here. Well, good noon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harvey Webster, and I hail from the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and for some inexplicable reason, I've been asked to speak with you today and actually share with you some stories about the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, some of the exciting things that are happening there, and why I personally believe that the Museum of Natural History is one of the most important, relevant, and impactful institutions in this region. But first of all, let's clear some things up. Okay, my title is Chief Wildlife Officer and Museum Ambassador. I got the ambassador gig about a year ago. You don't have to call me Your Honor. But it's reflects the fact that I have been at the museum for 45 years as a full-time staff person. But I actually remember clearly when I was 11 years old going to the brand new Kirtland Hall of Prehistoric Life, a brand new gallery that had just been opened in 1961. And in it, it had real dinosaurs and a real Dunkleosteus and all of these extraordinary treasures of nature that I had read about, that I had imagined about. But to see those real objects for the first time, I was blown away. The family lived in Shaker Heights at the time, so I went and turned our garage into a natural history museum and brought my third grade class from Malvern School over to see all of the great exhibits. And I even had a little flint chip or thing, something like that, that they could take with them as a souvenir. So I was totally into the museum experience, and I started taking classes there. I got my first job there working in archaeology. I worked in the paleontology department and the education department. And finally, after graduating from Cornell University, I came back and was hired to be there to work with the live animals at the Natural History Museum. And of course, a lot of people go, live animals at the Natural History Museum? I didn't know they had live animals. I thought everything was dead, stuffed, pickled, pressed. But indeed, we actually have something called the Ralph Perkins II Wildlife Center and Woods Garden. We've just updated it 2 years ago in a brand new facility that is just extraordinary. And it is a zoo of Ohio wildlife. Most of the animals have come to us from rescue or rehabilitation centers. And the whole intention of this center is to connect people with Ohio's rich natural heritage. When you go there and you see coyotes, if you have questions about coyotes, maybe you think that they're stalking you in your backyard, or they might be a threat to your pets, or you're wondering what role they might play in the environment, we can provide that. And also you can see real live coyotes up close, and you can see just how amazing an animal they are. Everything you find admirable about your dog is in a coyote, only they're much smarter. I mean, did you know that coyotes are exclusively monogamous? No cheating, no divorce, nothing. I mean, we pale in comparison to how faithful coyotes happen to be to one another. A study in Chicago over 18 years, 700 coyotes were tagged, radio collars put on them, blood taken. The genetics done from the blood has established the fact that there is no cheating. They've got their incredible family animals that they sustain themselves, and oftentimes they don't hunt as a pack, but they have a social unit, which is mom, dad, this year's kids, last year's kids, maybe the kids from the year before they go off on their own. So it's kind of cool to learn about something which is in every one of your neighborhoods. No matter where you live, you've got coyotes in your neighborhood, and if you haven't seen them, it's not because they're not there, it's because they choose not to be seen. And that they're no threat to you, but if you've got cats, we suggest you keep your cats indoors. And if you have small dogs, we suggest you walk them on a leash if they have to go out at night. You are the deterrent. And we can peacefully coexist with these really extraordinary predators which have moved into our state over the last 100 years. So that's one of the stories. We want that Perkins Wildlife Center, just like the entire museum, to be a trailhead to discovery about this region, about the science that allows us to understand nature. And then the nature of the science itself. How do we know what we know about the natural world. So I said that I would come with a few objects. You know, I'm in this death by PowerPoint these days, and I apologize if some of you were hoping to see a PowerPoint and bullet points and all sorts of graphs and things. That's not quite my style, but I did bring a little show and tell. So I would like to start with an object. You see, at a museum, we have objects. We have real things. If you're an art museum, you have real art, sculptures and paintings and the like. If you're a history center, you've got furniture and documents and clothing and things that relate to other ages. Well, at the Natural History Museum, we have things that represent the wonders of nature. And if you go to any stream cut around here, you might find a shale that's black in color. It's called the Cleveland member of the Ohio Shale Group. And this black shale is black because it's just teeming with organic matter. A little bit more organic matter, you could probably squeeze oil or gas out of it. And this is a really interesting deposit because it turns out this Cleveland member of the Ohio Shale are clay particles that rain down not too far from a continental margin in a shallow ocean that covered Cleveland, Ohio 363 million years ago. Underscore ocean, not a lake, an ocean. Because at that time, Cleveland, Ohio was underwater and 800 miles south of the equator. Why do we know that? Because geologists have now very, very reliably dated and established the movements of the plates, the continents across the planet over the years. I remember when I was taking geology at Cornell University in the year 1970, there was no mention of continental drift or plate tectonics. 3 years later, it was gospel, because they had done these searches at the bottom of the ocean and they'd found these ridges, these rift systems where the seafloor was spreading. They could date it, they could measure it, and they knew that the Atlantic Ocean was getting wider and wider, meaning North America was going west, Europe was going east. And then working backward, geologists have very comfortably come up with an amazing storyline about the history of the surface of the planet. It has not always been as it is today. So in that ocean, 363 million years ago, somewhere near a continental margin, all these clay particles are raining down, and in this shallow ocean, it turns out in the bottom waters there's not much oxygen. And so anything that happens to be swimming along, if it dies, and its body settles into the black muck at the bottom of that ocean, there's very little bacterial action to decompose it. And as it gets entombed in the sediments, over long periods of geologic time, the sediments get lithified, they get turned into rock. And then as those continental margins and things are bunching into each other, ultimately that land gets raised up out of the ocean. And it becomes part of the fabric of what we now know as Ohio. And if you have a river cut that cuts down through all of these sediments, the shales and the sandstones and the like around here, and exposes that black Cleveland member of the Ohio Shale, you sometimes find concretions, these strange sort of mushroom-shaped bedding irregularities, and occasionally in those concretions you will find this. This is a cast of the lower jaw or infranathal of Dunkleosteus torelli. This was a fish that was the largest living thing, the largest meat-eating thing at least, on planet Earth when it lived 363 million years ago.
How long was it?
How long? We think it was at least 20 feet long. Possibly there's one bone from one individual that might have it at 25 to 30 feet. So if you're thinking of a great white shark, you're thinking of a killer whale, think bigger. So this is the Tyrannosaurus rex of its time, because there are no dinosaurs. As a matter of fact, land animals, at least backboned land animals, are restricted to a few amphibians that are starting to crawl out of the water. So this is a fish from a group of fish called arthrodires, which are now totally extinct. As a matter of fact, they belong to a group called the placoderms, and the placoderm is the only class of backboned animals where the entire class of animal has become extinct. So there's no modern relative of this. But at the time, they were supremely adapted for what they were doing. And you notice in this infranathal, or this jaw, there are no teeth. Instead, you've got this meat cleaver-like blade for slicing other fish or the small sharks of the time. This thing is so amazing. It has armor, bony armor covering its head. It's got a skeleton that's made of cartilage and actually is not very well represented in the fossil record. But we find the head shields, and we've got some enormous ones on display at the museum, and they were named for a scientist who worked at the museum, Dr. David Dunkel, who described all of these things back in the 1940s, and in his honor, a French paleontologist about 10 years later named the entire genus after Dunkel. Dunkleosteus means Dunkel's bones. Interesting thing. The finest collection of these late Devonian fossil fish and sharks is found at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History. It represents almost 100 years of collecting of these rich specimens coming from places like Little Cedar Point in the Rocky River Valley or out near the Huron River. And when Interstate 71 was built from downtown Cleveland through the western neighborhoods of Cleveland, they were going through these black shales, and they encountered thousands of these concretions, almost every one of them having bones or some other kind of organic matter in them. This is a treasure trove, an extraordinary thing that gives us a window into one chapter of Cleveland's history. A unique clip. Yeah?
Why was that fish armored?
Well, that's a good question. One of the things that we find on it is we find gouges in its armor, which we think were made by other Dunkleosteuses. So whether this was sexual selection and this was something that they needed to armor themselves against their peers, whether there were sea scorpions or other large invertebrates or animals that were tough for them to grab and they needed to protect the head. They even have a bony sclerotic ring, a bony ring that protects the eye. They also have two ball and socket joints at the base of the top of the skull, so the top of the skull can come up while the jaws go down, increasing the gape. I mean, it seems like it's a marvelously designed fish. But unfortunately, things changed at the end of the Devonian. We're not quite sure what those changes were. It could be a decrease in oxygen in the world. And ultimately, these big fish could not make a go of it. And now they only live as specimens in a museum like ours. Yeah, Pam.
It wasn't our fault.
It was not, for once, it was not our fault. So this is just an example. If you go through layer upon layer upon layer of the rocks that underlie the city of Cleveland, all the sediments borne by ancient seas and laid down in these extraordinary sequences and raised by tectonic forces, they're like chapters in the history of this region. And so one of the things we do at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History is we tell you about paleontology, the study of ancient life, and how incredibly interesting and robust that is. You know, a lot of people, when they think about a natural history museum, they think, you know, you guys are just about dinosaurs. You're just thinking about the past. After all, you're talking about natural history, the history of nature, correct? Well, actually, I would submit to you that history and story are synonymous. In most languages, they are. The two words are interchangeable. So it's not that we're just concerned with the past. You need to be able to examine the past, to understand the present, to imagine the future. So yes, it pays to know where we've been, to understand how things are going now, to know the direction we might want to go. But the Museum of Natural History it covers lots of disciplines, from astronomy all the way to zoology and every discipline in between, including things like ecology, the discipline that looks at the interrelationship between organisms and each other and their environment, which is a very, very pertinent science to this day. Well, let me go down this line here. So we've got things that represent current stuff. This is a study skin of a young female snowy owl. All of you Harry Potter fans. Hedwig is a snowy owl. So you see just how enormous these owls are. They are normally residents of the Arctic. They live in treeless tundra areas in the far north, and they feed upon lemmings and seabirds and all sorts of things, anything they can pretty much get their talons into. But periodically, whether there's a shortage of food in the north, these birds will fly south. And occasionally we'll see large numbers of them, or what we call in the ornithological world an eruption, starting with the letter I, of these birds, and they show up here. And when they're here, they typically will look for places that look like tundra. So where in northeastern Ohio can you imagine a place that looks like treeless tundra? Airports. So Burke Lakefront Airport, Cuyahoga County Airport, and Hopkins are all great places to look for snowy owls. Oftentimes if you go to the, was it the 101st Bomber Group restaurant and you're out in their parking lot looking across towards the runways, you can sometimes in an eruption year, you can see these snowy owls that are perched on those landing lights. And actually Judith McMillan and I happened to be part of a banding of a snowy owl that decided to spend one winter at the intersection of Mayfield Road and Interstate 271. So, and it turns out that they're incredibly adept hunters. So this is one that unfortunately passed away, but now it becomes part of the permanent collection of the museum. So this is a contemporary organism. This is no dinosaur. Well, darn it, it is a dinosaur. Because one of the great insights that's come from the last 25 years is that two-legged dinosaurs were all covered with feathers, apparently without exception. And that means T-Rex had feathers. And we thought that the two-legged dinosaurs were the ancestors of modern birds. But if two-legged dinosaurs have feathers, then what's the difference between a two-legged dinosaur and a bird? And an ornithologist and a vertebrate paleontologist would actually come to total agreement there. There is no difference. Modern birds are dinosaurs. They're the ones that were able to survive the end of the Cretaceous when an asteroid smashed into the Earth. And then they have radiated out across the planet. There are now over 10,000 species of bird / dinosaurs surviving on planet Earth. They're one of the most successful groups of organisms, of backbone organisms on Earth. So dinosaurs live, dinosaurs rule. That's kind of cool, because if you accept that birds are dinosaurs, that means when you go to KFC, you get Kentucky Fried Dinosaur. What's it taste like? Chicken. Yeah. So if you come to our museum and you went down into the, as we affectionately say, the bowels of the museum, the layers of the museum under the main exhibit floor, you'll find all of these collections and research spaces. And we have, I don't know that we know how many things we have, probably millions, but remember we have archaeological excavations where you might have boxes of flint chips and potsherds that if you enumerated every one of them, there would probably be hundreds and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of things. But all of these objects, if they can be identified to where they came from in time and space, are voucher specimens, and they're used to understand the world around us and to be able to tell that story of nature. And that story gets kind of personal too, because you know what? Cleveland Museum of Natural History is about you and you and you and you. It's about us as a species. Because it turns out, once you understand this great parade of evolution on planet Earth, of how 3.6 billion years ago the first living things end up in that organic soup, less than 1 billion years after Earth was even forged from the dust cloud in the proto-solar system. We have life transforming the planet, blue-green algae taking carbon dioxide, splitting the carbon dioxide, harvesting the carbon, spitting out the oxygen, and over 1 billion years creating the conditions that allowed the evolution of higher life forms, of multicellular life forms. Every time you go, you inhale that sweet oxygen. 21% of what you're inhaling is oxygen. Thank a blue-green algae for about 1.5 billion years of spitting things out and totally transforming planet Earth, changing the oceans. Those of you who've ever been up to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan or been to the upper reaches of Minnesota, and you know the great ores that are the foundation of the iron ore and steel industry that's so important to this community here in Cleveland. If you see the banded hematite with the rusty red and then the gray bands, that actually is the rusting of the oceans that were being formed at the time by the oxygen that was coming out from these little one-celled organisms. And then gradually it percolated up in the atmosphere and changed the atmosphere and allowed evolution of much, much higher life forms. So it's an amazing part of that story. So that involves you. Also, we evolved. We are not apart from nature. We are not a part of nature. We are nature. Your closest living relative that's non-human would be a chimpanzee or a bonobo. And you know, you might look at a chimpanzee and you might say, well, yeah, I've got some people in my family tree that kind of look like that. But it turns out what I'm really looking at is your genome. If you compare the genome of a human being and a chimpanzee, about 98.5 or 6% is identical. It's less than 2% of the DNA that codes for a human or a chimp. And knowing the story of where we came from and how we got here is important. And this is another really, really cool thing about the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, because we are a center of expertise in paleoanthropology, the study of humans, but ancient humans. So I have something here. I can't pick up the whole part of it, but I'll pick up the top of the skull. This is a cast of Lucy. And Lucy was the 3.1 million year old hominin that was found and discovered by Dr. Donald Johansen at Hadar in Ethiopia in 1974. We're celebrating the 45th anniversary of the discovery of Lucy this year, and we're going to have a cool exhibit that opens up at the end of March, and we encourage you all to come down and see it and learn about it. Now, when you take a look at Lucy's skull, okay, the teeth are kind of, sort of, maybe kind of human-like. But this is a pretty tiny little head, and we think that Lucy was mature. Even though she stood only a little more than 3 feet tall, all of her wisdom teeth had erupted, so she was probably at least 18 years of age. So she had a little small head. So you might say, okay, so in identifying her, she's probably a 3.1 million year old chimpanzee, right? Well, no, not quite. Because it turns out, if you take a look at a chimpanzee, chimpanzees have got really, really, really long hands and kind of funky little thumbs, and the thumbs are way back here, and they really can't do this very well because they're dedicated knuckle walkers. The way they get around is on all fours. They've got short hind legs, they've got really long legs, and knuckle walking is a superb mechanism for getting along on the ground as well as in the trees. They also have an opposable big toe. So one of the questions in 1974, when Don Johansen was out in the deserts of Ethiopia searching for human origins, the big question was, well, what led to the evolution of us? Did we start with a big brain? Did we start with our ability to manipulate the environment and create technology? Did we start as upright walkers? Did we start with culture? Did we start with language? What was the first step in becoming human? Well, when Lucy was discovered, they discovered 40% of her skeleton. And if you mirror image that 40%, you get 80% of the skeleton, including 1/2 of the hip, an entire knee, a shoulder, an elbow. And it was clear in studying those bones, and experts from around the world came here, Dr. Tim White, Dr. Owen Lovejoy from Kent State University, along with Don, and they came to the conclusion that Lucy was a total upright walker. Instead of having chimp-like hips, the blades of the hip had already moved forward to accommodate our style of upright walking. So the first step in the evolution of our ancestors was to be upright walkers. Why? Well, maybe changing ecology. You had a shrinking rainforest and expanding savanna. So things like gorillas and chimpanzees were confined to those tropical rainforests, but perhaps our ancestors decided to try their luck out in the savanna. And one of the things that the evolution of our species as an upright walker is it allows us to carry things so we can provision our families and our mates. It also allows for long distance and endurance activities. If a baboon runs at a sprint, it can run much faster than you'll ever run, but it can only run about 100 yards and it overheats. Humans can run marathons. Humans can run all day long. A former colleague of mine, Melissa Terwilliger, was one of these endurance runners, and she would run 100-mile races, 24 hours jogging on trails. That's what the human body is capable of. So a dramatic shift that served us well out in those open areas. But while we're out there and you're upright, you've got your hands freed from locomotion. Now you can pick up a rock and you can throw it. Well, a chimp can do that, but not with a whole lot of accuracy. But if you've got a rock and you come upon like a lion kill of a zebra and you take that rock and you smash one of the big long bones, inside is a treasure trove of fat and protein called bone marrow that would only normally be accessible to hyenas. Now it's accessible to you. So the idea of being able to use our hands, use a stone, or make technology set us on this feedback loop, it seems, where there's selection for bigger and bigger brain, more and more dexterous use of our environment, more ingenious technology, and somewhere along the line, the ability for complex language. And once we have complex language, then instead of a slow evolution, now we can uncouple from biological evolution, and we have cultural evolution where you can sit down with your kids or your grandkids and you can bestow upon them all of the stuff that you've learned in your life and that you learned from your forebears. So now you have a mechanism for the transfer of technology and information and wisdom that becomes independent of genes. And that seems to be the story that leads to us, the most dominant organism that planet's ever seen. But it also reminds us that we are a product of organic evolution, that we need clean water and clean air, that we are coupled to every other living thing on the planet. Unless we go around and just decide that we can rearrange things with impunity, without having any kind of consequences, I think we've learned that this biosphere that we reside in, this thin layer of planet Earth, 100,000 feet up into the air, maybe 10 miles down below the surface of the planet, that's where life is. And that's the only place where life is. And as far as we know, that's the only place in the universe where life is. The astronomers tell us that the odds of Earth-like planets elsewhere are very high, but as far as we know, the only place where life exists is here. And over 3.6 billion years, it's evolved into this glorious, diverse, and resilient planet that we live on today. But it gives us clean water. It gives us clean air. It's responsible for providing the environment in which we need to survive. So we should be mindful of the services that ecosystems and other living things provide us. And that leads us to the whole idea of sustainability. At the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, we have an interesting mission statement. Our first job is to inspire a passion for nature. We want to ignite curiosity in all of our audiences, to learn about this rich natural world that we live in. Because the more you learn, the more you want to learn. You want to take it as far as you possibly can. You want to understand both the history, but also the workings today. And as I said before, isn't that essential to be able to imagine a future? So we say that we want to inspire a passion for nature through science and education. We also work very diligently to protect biodiversity, natural diversity. How do we do that? Well, we try and engage people in nature so that they give a damn. But also, the museum, over the last well, pretty much 50, 60 years in particular, has been acquiring land. We have been protecting really, really special places, habitats across the northeastern Ohio landscape. We now have 10,000 acres of some of the finest natural areas in the state. This constellation of some 55 plus natural areas is an important repository for rare and threatened plants and animals and habitats, bogs and fens and sand barrens and cathedral forests. If you've ever been to Mentor Marsh out in Lake County, that's a museum nature preserve. So the idea that a museum would have something other than Dunkleosteus bones from 360 million years ago, something other than stuffed birds and pressed plants and pickled fish, something other than human ancestors from 3.1 million years. We actually have a collection of real live habitats maintained in perpetuity, both as refugia, but also something we can return to again and again and study and know the dynamics. We can also use those natural areas to measure things like climate change. You know, what's happening in the world around us, can we measure and track that on the properties that we've got? We also have an interesting aspect to the institution. We foster health. And it turns out that back in 2006, we merged with the Health Education Museum, which had rebranded itself as Health Space Cleveland. They had fallen on some hard times. They had a very important mission. They merged with us, and now human health is central to what we do. And you might think, well, why does that relate? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry, that wonderful health museum we had, is it coming back?
It'll come back via the exhibits that we will have in our next phase at the Museum of Natural History.
If you grow your museum, you'll put back some of those.
Some of those things, if they're appropriate, but let me just say that we are totally committed to the mission of fostering human health. And here's the connection too. If you want to be healthy, you can do all the right things. I'm sure you made all the healthy choices over here for lunch today. But you know what? Can you be healthy if your environment's not? No, it's impossible. So the idea of individual health is linked ultimately to environmental health. Okay? Can you be healthy? Turns out that we might be the dominant organism on planet Earth, but our success comes with biomechanical baggage. You got a bad back? Chimpanzees don't get bad backs. They don't get bad hips. They don't get bad knees. They're not bipedal. These are all a consequence of the modification, the route that we took as upright walkers. Because remember, natural selection can only work with what it has available. And so there is some biomechanical baggage. You know, our bodies are remarkable things, but sometimes we don't age quite as gracefully as we'd like to. And so knowing our evolutionary story. And then there's another dimension to health, and that's cultural. And so we have a curator of human health and evolutionary medicine who is taking the mission of the old Health Education Museum forward and trying to make sure that we're engaging people in this three-pronged approach to understanding health and what we can do to be much more healthy as individuals and healthy as a population. Yeah?
Your talk is so wonderful, I don't want to stop you, but at the same time, Franz de Waal, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, I'm reading his bonobo books. Mm-hmm. Is there anywhere in Ohio that people can go and see a bonobo?
There are no bonobos, I believe, in Ohio. There are chimpanzees.
The closest bonobo would probably be in Atlanta.
That I don't know, but
Did you ever see a bonobo?
I have not seen one in captivity. I mean, so a bonobo is a species of chimpanzee. So when you think about chimpanzees, you usually think about the chimpanzees that Jane Goodall studied at Gombe and that you find in the east. So the bonobos are actually found in the rainforests of Western Africa, places like Gabon. And they're just intriguing. They've got a different social structure than traditional chimpanzees and are considered to be much more closely related to humans than traditional chimpanzees.
I would encourage everyone to read a book called The Bonobo and the Atheist, 2016. He wrote several books. You will find it hilarious and highly educational. Really a great book.
He's a great author, and I believe he is with the Primate Center down there in Atlanta. Yeah.
Just a question sort of related to that. Our European cousin has been sequenced.
I'm sorry?
European cousin of Homo sapiens
Uh-huh.
has been sequenced by Dr. Salman. So they become extinct for some reasons, disappeared from the planet, right?
So actually, the human genome has been totally sequenced, and Neanderthals have also been sequenced, and that provided an incredible revelation, and that is if you are not African, you might have as much as 2% of your genome is Neanderthal, and it just means that as Neanderthal populations were declining and humans were involved in this huge diaspora across Europe and Asia, we had opportunities to not only interbreed with Neanderthals, but clearly that part of the genome that still persists today conferred some advantage on those hybrids. And they found also another group called the Denisovans that are found in sort of Central Europe, and they actually recently came up with an individual that when they sequenced this individual, female, that she was half Neanderthal and half Denisovan. Yeah.
And half what?
Half Denisovan is this other group of not quite Homo sapiens that were in Central Asia. Yeah.
My question is that they became extinct for certain reasons, which we still don't understand. That, the Neanderthals, they became extinct.
Right, we do.
So can it happen to Homo sapiens?
So the question is, can extinction happen to Homo sapiens? Absolutely. As a matter of fact, you could argue that we're well on our way. And I don't mean that to be doom and gloom, but we sometimes fail to realize the connection between healthy environments and ecosystem, a healthy biosphere, and our own continued success. That, if we set things off on rampant climate change, the idea is that there's going to have huge impacts on us that will affect things like agriculture and the way that we do business, where rain does and does not occur. Do we have the water that we need? We've been in a very, very stable climate for a long, long time, at least, the last 10,000 years. There's been some warming trends, there's been a little ice age in there, but basically it's been very constant. Our civilization has been the beneficiary of that constant. But you know what? The difference between climate and weather is climate is what you expect, weather is what you get. And as the two of them diverge, all of a sudden you have to say, well, the climate is in fact changing. So yes, can we envision the extinction of humans? I certainly hope not. I think that we are an amazing sentient being and that we've got all the tools needed to lead to a sustainable future, which it turns out is the last segment of our mission statement. The idea of trying to create opportunities for people to envision, to imagine that future that is sustainable, that allows us to be better stewards of the planet in which we live. Okay, so we exist to inspire through science and education a passion for nature, protection of natural diversity, fostering of health, and leadership to a sustainable future.
Harvey?
Yep.
Question. This last trip to Mars, did we come up with anything to substantiate what you're saying?
So coming up with Mars, they're finding intriguing things about the fact that there might be liquid water below the surface, which is intriguing. And they're also finding some more complex molecules that might be suggestive that there was life at one time. But one of the things that Jim Lovelock, the environmental scientist, came up with a long time ago, said, you know what? If you look at Mars or Venus, and you take a look at the composition of the atmosphere, what's it composed of? It's almost all carbon dioxide. Venus is greenhouse gases gone crazy. You look at Earth, what's our atmosphere? Nitrogen and oxygen. And what Lovelock said years and years ago is that that's the signature of life. Our entire atmosphere was created by life. That's something, you know, there's a whole nitrogen cycle where nitrogen gets fixed by bacteria, used by plants, and then that, in the decomposition of the plant matter, there's bacteria that release the nitrogen back to the atmosphere. It's all part of a cycle. And clearly the oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. Life has transformed the planet. So if there was life on Mars a long, long time ago, I mean, maybe there's one-celled organism someplace, but it certainly didn't gain the traction that life gained on planet Earth. Earth is in the sweet spot. We're in the Goldilocks zone, where we have liquid water and a lot of it. We have a robust magnetic field because we've got this iron-nickel core, solid core, spinning around in a liquid core, and that generates this magnetic field that protects us from the solar winds. Without the solar winds, our atmosphere would have been blown off Earth a long, long time ago, as it has been to a great extent on Mars. So that, you know, we got everything. You know, Goldilocks would be really happy on planet Earth. We got it all. We're not too hot, not too cold, and we have all those conditions that were ripe for life. And that's why just this whole idea of taking these stories, because ultimately the universe is not made up of atoms. It's made up of stories. It's these stories of nature that are informed by science. Science is the lens by which we go and understand the world around us, that we can be predictive about it, that we can understand in the workings of it. But the more we discover, the richer and richer the story becomes, and how all of the parts of the story help reinforce one another. So we think that the mission of the Museum of Natural History is pretty important. How do we carry it on? We have scientists, we have curators in all sorts of disciplines that are at the forefront of their scientific research, and they're advancing the level of understanding, whether it's in paleoanthropology with Dr. Johannes Haile Selassie, whether it's in invertebrate zoology with the great mantid. One of our scientists, Gavin Svensson, is the world expert on the praying mantis family, which encompasses 3,500 species worldwide. He just got back from Gabon collecting species, and many of the species he's collected are brand new to science. So he's at the forefront where he's actually identifying animals that have never been described to science before. Advancing. You can't do conservation. You can't save a species if you don't even know that you have a species. There might be 10 million species of living things on planet Earth. We have names for maybe 1 million of them. Got a long, long way to go. And in certain areas, we stand to lose those species due to environmental degradation before we've ever even identified who they are. So we've got these extraordinary scientists that bring authenticity to what we do and what we say. We've got an incredibly robust group of educators that connect people with the story of nature at all ages and all levels. Come on down tomorrow night. We have Think and Drink with the Extinct. It's expedition archaeology. You'll have an opportunity to kick back with your favorite adult beverages from breweries and distilleries around here, but you'll learn about Brian Redman and the extraordinary archaeology program that we have at the Museum of Natural History, and how they're able to understand and infer from material culture how people lived 1,000 years ago. So really cool stuff. Yeah?
It's not for Think and Drink with the Extinct, but grandchildren, there's probably a few in here. What's the youngest audience you've ever had where you think you could put what you've learned and have fun with it and make sense to them?
Well, I think that any age, you know, so I just did a program for Park Synagogue yesterday, for the sisterhood at Park Synagogue, but I had an animal with me, so they said, would you mind going in and talking to the preschool? So I had a bunch of kids. I think there were 12 of them. I lost the ability to determine how old they were. They're this tall, or maybe slightly taller. And
Harvey, when I used to do the school classes, I would take anyone under 4th grade. So we had preschool up to 4th grade when I was doing.
There you go. But so just sitting down, and I brought out a great horned owl, and talking to them about what an owl is all about, and how an owl functions, you know, and these talons and the hooked beak and where they live. And this is an amazing animal that could be living, if you've got an old woodlot next to wherever you live, whether it's in the city or in the country, could be in your own backyard. And these kids, I think, were blown away by that. I mean, they were obviously really into seeing a live animal, but I think this is the idea of there is a universal aspect to this. E.O. Wilson, the great biologist of our time, the Darwin of our time, coined the expression biophilia, that we have an innate love of nature because we are a product of it, we are part of it, we are nature. It's hardwired into us. That sometimes our worries about day in and day out, of getting the kids to school or, doing whatever we do, those things sometimes get in the way. And I will tell you that these things really get in the way of reality, except if you happen to be an amateur birder and you've got iBird on your phone and you hear a bird call, you can play back the bird call on your phone and you can identify the bird you just heard, in which case it's a very useful tool. But this whole idea of, we really rue the fact that we're getting divorced from nature, that we're not having that kind of contact. There's a whole movement afoot called Vitamin N Network. It's the whole idea of how do we get our kids involved in nature? Something about nature play schools. In Scandinavian countries and many European countries, they've got these things where there are no playgrounds, there's a woods next to the school, and the kids get free time to go out there and they can climb things. If they fall off, they learn something. The idea that you don't have to overprotect the world, you need to give opportunities for people to explore. I remember as a kid, in the summertime, Mom would say, after breakfast, be home by dinner. We had carte blanche to go explore the neighborhood in Shaker Heights, or when we were visiting my grandmother out in Kirtland Hills. I mean, it was, those days seem to have gone. Maybe we need to take the best of those to create those opportunities. And certainly as parents and grandparents, we can provide those opportunities for our kids. So to make sure that everybody is involved and engaged in the story and the wonder of nature. Okay, so speaking of those kids, it so happens that I thought I would bring a live animal to share with you. So, not so that the kids would get all the fun, but we do have the Perkins Wildlife Center, and the Perkins Wildlife Center not only has exhibits of native wildlife, but we also have live animals that are an essential and integral part of our educational program. We teach almost 100,000 kids a year at the Museum of Natural History. It's a really stunning number when you compare us to our peer institutions. We have a great program now called Inspire, where every second grader in the Cleveland Metropolitan School District comes to the museum for an entire day of instruction. They go to our Perkins Wildlife Center, they meet our live animals, they get to handle real specimens, and really hammer home the idea of animal adaptation and habitat, which are called for in the school state-mandated curriculum. The cooler part of that program, though, is in May we have Inspire Family Day. So every one of those students, every second grader in CMSD, gets a coupon that gets them and their family in the museum free on Inspire Family Day. And as these kids come into the museum with their families, they own the museum because they know it. Mom, Dad, let me show you the Haplocanthosaurus. Have you ever seen Dunkleosteus? And the parents are like blown away by how smart their kids are. And you're deepening that relationship, and you're also introducing a whole group of people for whom going to a museum might be a foreign concept. And you're showing them that a museum, whatever kind of museum it is a place of wonder, a place of discovery, a place of engagement. It's really cool stuff. So the live animals are an important part of our educational tool, and this is one of the hardest working animals at the museum. So I'd like you to meet Tamarack, and Tamarack is a great horned owl. Now Tam's story, about, 10 years ago, it was 2009, in western Pennsylvania, she made an ill-fated decision. She decided to fly across a road one night. Unfortunately, she was struck by a car. She was hit in the head and permanently damaged her right eye. And as you look at her face, you'll notice that one pupil looks different than the other. The left eye is the functional eye, the right eye, non-functional. It turns out that she was taken to the Tamarack Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. That's where she got her name. And they did their best to rehabilitate her, but they knew with having only vision in one eye that she wasn't really going to be able to be released. And so we heard about her and we got her at the Museum of Natural History. And this is the pretty typical way that I get the live animals that I have at the museum. Reminding me to tell you about the coyotes. Anyway, so once we get a bird like this, then it's our job to gain her confidence using falconry techniques, jesses, swivels and leashes and gauntlets. We gain her confidence so she's calm and quiet beside us so that we can take her into a classroom, we can take her into an auditorium, we can take her to a wildlife festival. I mean, she's been in Judith McMillan's living room. She gets around. So the fact of the matter is that this is a kind of a portable feast. So we can take this living resource and we can take it to audiences all over the place. Because you know what? Ultimately, you know what a natural history museum is about? Life. As I said before, the only place that we know where life exists is right here on planet Earth. We should have a reverence for life and a respect for life and to nurture the living systems that sustain us. So, great place to start with a great horned owl. A couple things about great horned owls. You'll notice she's got large eyes. She does not, however, have eyeballs. And what I mean by that is her eyes are not spherical like our eyes are. They expand. They're like a funnel with the narrow opening of the funnel actually being the outside surface. They expand into the head. They're surrounded by a bony sclerotic ring and they don't move in the socket. So if she wants to see something off to the right here, she has to turn her head and look in that direction. If she wants to look at something over there, she rotates her head and looks in that direction. And if she wants to look straight over her back, she can look almost straight over her back. About 270 degrees of rotational ability to that neck. By the way, she's hot. She lives outside, so it's a little warm in here. And that's called gular flutter. That's a way that a bird like this cools off. So it turns out that they've got these amazing eyes, forward-facing, don't move in the socket, but fortunately they've got 14 cervical vertebrae in their neck, twice the number you and I get, that allows them to effortlessly swivel that head around to see what's going on around them. They've got incredible hearing, and their ears are located behind that facial disc to the right and left of each eye, and there's a black line that sort of is the outer limit, if you will, of that facial disc right here and right there. They do have these things. Those are not real horns, nor are they ears, they're just feathers, and they're probably used for signaling and camouflage. So, horned owl. Why is she a great horned owl? I think you get the sense. This is a really large bird. 4-foot wingspan, almost 2 feet long. She is ginormous, as my daughter would say. But when you ask how much does she weigh? 1 million pounds. You try having a great horned owl and no, she weighs just shy of 4 pounds. So this is where things get deceiving. Let me put my microphone down. If I take the finger, touch her neck, look how far my finger goes. I got to get a look this way. She's all feathers. If you saw her with no feathers on, you know what she would be? Embarrassed. But she'd also be half the size of what you see in front of you. Yeah?
Can she understand some language, some words or something like that?
I don't know that she can. Can she understand language? We sometimes use whistles or clicking sound to elicit behaviors as a form of target training, so they quickly learn to understand that. I think that she is comforted by a familiar voice of someone that has handled her. But even though I've spent my entire professional career with birds of prey, they're kind of two-dimensional. It's kind of like, show me the mouse, or I'm not really very interested. On the other hand, crows, ravens, jays, and magpies are brilliant. Just, there's no other, there's a crow from the South Pacific called the New Caledonia crow that not only uses tools, it manufactures the tools it uses, makes these fishhook things that it can use to snare big beetle larvae behind bark. They can come up with independent strategies that they've learned and link them together to successfully come up with a solution. And their form of cognition is not like ours. We're sort of by trial and error. They kind of look at it and get it. So they are brilliant, and we know the parrots, the citizens, are also really brilliant. So that seems to be the high point in bird cognition. These guys have enormous talons. I'm not wearing the glove because she's got cold feet. Her talons could go right through my skin. Those are the business end of an owl that it uses to catch its food. And since we've done that, I think I can do this without having any repercussions. They're just a stunning bird. That massive hooked beak, which they can use for killing an animal and tearing it into bite-sized pieces. You can see again those enormous eyes. And of course, one of the things about owls is that not all owls give a hoot, but this one does. This one makes a low-pitched, booming, monotonous hoot that goes like this. Oh, 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 oh. And when you first hear it, it sounds like a dog barking way off in the distance. But you'll hear that pattern repeat over and over again. Then you know you're listening to a great horned owl. There's other hoot owls out there like barred owls, but the great horned owl has a very, very wide distribution in Ohio. Yeah?
Does she let you pet her?
She lets me pet her. Does she find any enjoyment? No. But she does tolerate it, yeah. So I hope I've given you a little bit of a sense about the museum. We are definitely an institution of science. We are definitely an institution of education. We have amazing artists at the museum that take the message of science, that take the message of nature and convert that into exhibits and other materials that we can use to hopefully ignite that curiosity. Because the sweet spot for any museum is public engagement. Sweet spot is using the tools we have, the scientific tools, the collections, whether they're living or whether they're not, using those in such a way that we can achieve the goals of our mission and connect people with nature and science. It really is the core business of our institution. And we invite you, there's a lot of materials here, and Cheryl Hoffman, who is our director of individual philanthropy and planned giving, is right over there. She just raised her hand. If we can answer any of your questions, encourage you to come on down to the museum and learn more about it. We would certainly invite you to do so. Yes?
How is it that birds with their feathers can go through -10 degrees and up to 100 degrees and survive in our climate?
Okay, so it's how can birds with their feathers go from these climatic extremes, from a polar vortex to the temperatures of the summer? Well,
We had -10.
polar vortex. So we have these contour feathers. Now the contour feathers that form the shape of this bird are constantly being preened. And as a bird preens, it will occasionally reach over its back, and above its tail is this funny little gland called a europygial gland. It pinches it and gets droplets of waxy fatty acid in its beak, so that as it preens the feathers, it waterproofs and conditions the feathers. So that maintains the contour, which is waterproof and a very good windbreak. And then between the skin and the contour feathers, you have downy feathers. And you know if you have a down coat or a down vest, downy feathers of birds, for their weight, are the most efficient insulating material known to humans. Natural material. I think the belly scales or tiles of a space shuttle might be a little bit more efficient, but anyway, it's pretty impressive. So that this bird, which normally has a temperature, body temperature, core temperature that's higher than ours, is above 100 degrees, maybe 101 or 102 degrees, can keep itself warm no matter how cold it gets. They also do sensible things. You always face the wind. If you don't face the wind tends to ruffle your feathers, and it disturbs the insulating power of your feathers. And then the birds that stick around here in the wintertime, whether it's a bird of prey like a great horned owl, or whether it's a chickadee eating the sunflower seeds at your feeder, in both cases they're eating high-fat, high-energy, densely packed caloric food. as opposed to, eating something that might have less energy in it, so that they've got a rich food supply. Then you'll find other birds that do their best behaviorally to find respite from the cold. If you're a chickadee, you might go in a hollow tree. And not only that, but you might go in a hollow tree with other chickadees. Okay, it gets warmer the more birds you have in there. Get out of the wind, it gives you that much protection. Some ground birds will sometimes get in snowbanks, because if you get in snowbanks, the snow itself acts as an insulator. It's not going to keep you at 50 degrees. I mean, it's not going to create a temperature there, but it might create an environment of 30 degrees when core temperature above the snow is actually 10 below. So there's a lot of ways that animals are adapted to be able to survive in winter. Not only survive, but totally succeed in winter. But you are right, winter is an unforgiving season. As far as getting along in the summertime, a lot of birds, as they molt in the late spring, they lose the downy feathers. So now you've lost that insulating blanket because you don't need it during the summertime. And just as Tamarack has shown you here, you have the ability to pant. And these birds not only have lungs, but catch this, they have air sacs. And when she breathes in, the air doesn't go into the lungs, it goes into her posterior air sacs. She breathes out, the air goes into her lungs. She breathes in, the air goes into her anterior air sacs. And then she breathes out, she finally exhales that breath. So it's a one-way, very, very efficient system of extracting oxygen, and all of those air sacs can be used. You can literally sweat on the lining of the air sacs to get rid of excess heat. By the way, bar-headed geese will oftentimes been seen flying over the Himalayas at 29,000 feet, engaged in vigorous athletic activity, flying, and yet they're in the death zone at 29,000 feet where there shouldn't be enough oxygen. How can they do that? Because they've got that incredible respiratory system. Okay, so I hope you've given you a little taste of the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and I hope that we encourage you to come on out. We've got great traveling exhibits. We've got something called Biomechanics, Built to Survive. We've got a great exhibit that's up to the 10th of March on Andy Warhol's Endangered Species series, just fabulous. Come and check that out. We are going to be celebrating Lucy's 45th coming up at the end of March. And then coming up this summer, we're going to have an exhibit on Fossil Hunter, all about the work of Dr. Johannes Haile Selassie and the other great paleoanthropologists at the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, and how they really restructured our family tree. You've been a great audience. Oh, wait.
I'm going to tag on. Jim asked about programs for children. We have the Balto Festival coming up on March 2nd. It's a great afternoon, day-long celebration starting at 10 some other organizations that are partnering with us and celebrating 100 years of the Balto experience. And if you are interested in coming, I have my card on the table. Please feel free to give me a call or drop me an email, and I can arrange to have tickets for you at the front desk, or email them or mail them to you, whatever might work best. So thank you, everyone, for inviting us to be here.
Yes, thank you very much. Appreciate it.